Hi, I'm David Charles Rodrigues, director of Neymar, The Perfect Chaos. And it's a real honor to be on factual South America, I guess, on this episode.
Neymar! Breaking news is a world record deal for Neymar.
222 millions d'euros.
Peso ainda é absurdo.
Sem você, não, eu tô pronto pra festa, foda-se.
C'est un joueur, il simule trop, il se prend trop pour une star, il a trop pris la grosse tête.
Por mais que você possa falar assim, eu sou pai, não é uma gestão fácil.
Quando mim você fala que eu faço um monte de merda, é por isso.
Não, mas qual é a minha opinião?
Eu não gosto de contradição. Vem sendo foda.
This is Factual America. We're brought to you by Alamo Pictures, an Austin and London-based production company making documentaries about America for international audiences. I'm your host, Matthew Sherwood. Each week, I watch a hit documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and their subjects. This week, it is my pleasure to welcome the award-winning filmmaker David Charles Rodrigues, the director of the Netflix docuseries Neymar, The Perfect Chaos. The name says it all. The film documents the rise to footballing glory of Neymar Júnior, one of the best soccer players in the world. Neymar's path has not been without its setbacks, challenges, and controversies, as most of you will know. But in the process of telling Neymar's story, David also shines a light on fame, celebrity, and fatherhood in a social media age. David, welcome to Factual America. How are things with you?
Everything's great. Neymar, The Perfect Chaos, our series was released this morning. So it's been a pretty crazy day, but really fun to finally share it with the world.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you have, and congratulations on that achievement. Yes, it's we're recording this on January 25th. So yes, the Neymar, The Perfect Chaos has just started streaming on Netflix, and it's a 3-part docuseries, and highly recommend you give it a watch. I mean, it sounds like a silly question given the name of the film, but maybe you can give us a little synopsis or tell us what Neymar, the film, is all about.
Absolutely. Well, Neymar, the athlete, is one of the greatest and highest paid football players of all time. In America, it would be soccer players, but also one of the most controversial, which you'll understand when you see the series. The series really focuses on, he's someone that is always in the media and always on social media. So it was a real challenge to find another angle in and really show a side of him that hasn't been shared before. And that was really the goal of making the series. And I feel really proud of what we accomplished. You really get up close and personal relationship with Neymar and the relationship between him and his father, who's also his business manager. And that's really the heart and soul of the show is just you get to meet Neymar, the person, more than in any other instance in his career.
Well, that was one of the things I was going to ask you, the challenges of making a film about an iconic personality who's basically grown up on social media in front of our eyes. But as you said, you wanted to focus in on things that maybe people didn't know about or get to the essence of who Neymar is. I mean, what are we going to see, if you go a little more detail, what are we going to see that maybe we haven't seen before? Even for those people who've been following him on social media all these years.
I think you get to meet him, as a person more than anything. And obviously the inner workings of him as a brand and as a business through his father are also things that aren't really very public, and they really kind of open themselves up to this experience. Obviously all of this, we followed him during the 2019-2020 season, which was, full of ups and downs. But that was a kind of a bridge to be able to tell, his career and also a little study on his legacy moving forward. So it's a mix of very fresh, never before seen moments and footage and stories, with some key moments that really show you how he got to where he is right now.
Yeah, and what you've spent all this time with him. Like you said, the 2019-20 season with its ups and downs. I mean, what was your experience? What drives him? And what is he like? From a filmmaker standpoint, especially.
Yeah. I in my work on anything I do, I really try to go in with no preconceived notions. Even if I have any, I'll leave them at the door. And it's like meeting a person for the first time, right? And with him, I was pleasantly surprised at how quickly we were able to create that connection and how he trusted my process and really was his true self. I think I also got lucky that I found him in a moment in his life where he was ready to bear all and to really share his essence. And I think he understood that this documentary format and Netflix was the right platform to be able to do that, right? Because you can't really do that in a sports interview or either on social media. Yeah. I think once he understood my approach and once he caught on to the types of questions I was asking him, I think it really helped him understand the type of movie that we were making, and it was nothing that he's ever really experienced before, as an athlete or as a celebrity. The thing that surprised me about him is actually his demeanor. He's very sweet, very soft-spoken, quite shy. His persona, in his day-to-day life is I don't want to say different, but it's a different tone of what you see, whether it's his explosive genius on the field or his celebrity party vibe on social media.
Right. I mean, doesn't his father even describe him as naive, I think, or something similar to that effect?
And it's interesting, you can, if you're watching the series as a skeptical, you can kind of cringe at that moment, but I can guarantee you that is very true. He is. I think it's a little more nuanced than the term naive. I think naive is a little bit too straightforward. Yeah. I think he's really authentic. He grew up, his first big contract, I think his first million was around between 12 and 14. And he was already, a celebrity in his hometown when he was 9 years old.
Yeah.
So you kind of grew up in that environment. And what I think was really awesome about him is that he really preserved his essence throughout this whole time. And I feel like after all the setbacks he had, from 2017 to 2019, that really helped reground him. And I think he looked back in his heart and captured that essence. And a big part of that essence too is his, he really loves to play football, that's really, drives him. That's literally, I know it sounds very simplistic, but that's literally what drives him is he loves to play. He obviously, like people like LeBron or Jordan or even Kobe, they all win, right? They're like hyper competitors. He also has that in him and but I think even above that, he just loves to play. Like any moment is a moment for him to play, whether it's, playing football, beyond his practice, but also playing video games or card games with his friends. Yeah. Right. Like the idea of playing a game is just, it is him.
Yeah. I mean, I think you've, just to reiterate what you're saying, and as someone who has seen the series, and thank you, Netflix. I didn't have to binge watch it today to get through the whole thing. I was able to see it over the last few days, but, that episode 3, this where you're very fortunate as a filmmaker. You're capturing him at a very interesting time in his life when he's, as you say, I think he's getting back in touch with who the true Neymar Júnior is. It seems like, and that whole scene with him, this horrible situation we've all been in with COVID and everything, but he finds himself again in his love for football. Even Mbappe talks about seeing him coming back on the training pitch and how football is this refuge for them. It's what they all love to do.
Yeah. Every filmmaker's dream or their hope is to show their main character's transformation, right? Or to find a transformational moment in their lives, right? Or in their careers or whatever. that you're showing, right? And we really lucked out with the fact that we were able to capture, in a he's turning 30 this year, but in a strange way, his coming of age, right?
Yeah.
It is quite a coming of age story where, even in the press and in social media, when I started filming, they would call him, Neymar Júnior or Neymar the Kid.
Yeah.
And by the time we finished filming, it became a hashtag and a whole thing during the Champions League that it was adult Ney. Even the New York Times wrote a really great article about how he finally came into his own.
Yeah.
Some people may say that's a little bit later in life, but realistically, when you have the type of life he has, it's, it is the right time for him. This is a very weird, but there's a movie I really love. It's an independent film from the 90s by Rebecca Miller called Personal Velocity. And what the film really shows is that we can't compare ourselves to other people. We achieve in our lives at different ages, and I feel like for Neymar, this was his coming of age. This was his consecration into adulthood.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think it's what I also found interesting because as you said, it's, he's just Neymar now. But for those of us who've been following football for a while, we do remember him as, first of all, as Neymar Jr. And obviously where there's a junior, there's a senior. And as you've said already, there's the man behind the player. It's not something, I think that's another thing, as you've already said, many of us would not have necessarily seen before. And I found his father very interesting and compelling on many different levels. And as you're capturing this father-son dynamic, and actually 3 generations really, because of his Neymar's son, Neymar Jr.'s son. But even he's constantly makes reference to the hero, and whether it's comic book heroes or whatever. He's got, this guy who's, I don't know his background, but he was he himself was a footballer, and but he's definitely got an eye for the story and the story arc and things like that, which I found very interesting.
Yeah, Neymar Senior, we could have easily portrayed him like a Britney Spears father character.
Yeah.
But that's just not true. He's way more complex and way more interesting and way more unique of a story. Like this guy, there's many rags to riches stories in sports history, and Neymar's story is exceptional, not unique. His father's story is very unique. His father went from being almost amateur player, like a semi-pro player, failed semi-pro player, to then a bricklayer, which in Brazil is really the lowest paying job you can ever have, to only 10 years later making the biggest deal in sports history when he went from Barcelona to PSG. The level, the velocity of learning that this guy has and how he's able to apply himself, I've really never seen anything like that before. And, of course he is brash and he has his shortcomings, he can be, somewhat of a bulldozer at times. And, in the lines between being a father and a manager blur all the time, and because of his continuous and just overwhelming success, with his, Neymar as a brand and then as a professional athlete, the father taking care of this career, it really created a distance between them, just by the nature of things. It's just very hard. I do believe that in his heart, he wants the best interests for his son. But there's always that thin line between, your interests and then the interests of the person that you're working with. Right. And that's a very thin line that we really tried to tread on and just show the nuances and complexities. But even through this process of that year and of Neymar's maturing, I think the father also grew a lot and understood that for him to be able to rescue that relationship with his son, he would have to let go of certain and really give Neymar a bigger stage to his own life and career. You know, it's. I mean, I could go on for hours talking about the dad, but he's a really fascinating character. They do deeply love each other.
Yeah.
But that love, sometimes gets expressed in ways that aren't that fun, and we captured those.
Well, that's a lot of families, though, isn't it? I mean, but as you said, he's extremely unique. I mean, maybe if you don't mind, you say you could talk about him for hours. If you don't mind spending a few more minutes on him, I mean, maybe putting this in context, we're not just talking about even just acting as his manager. I mean, he's created this whole sports marketing business, hasn't he? Around that's just solely about Neymar. I mean, how many people does he employ? It's tens, 30 something, or something like that. It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, at the time we were filming, I think he had 140 employees.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, no, it's
Wow.
And it's instinct. He took a few courses along the way. He said something to me. I don't even know if it's in the series, but it really stuck with me. He was like, when Neymar was, I think when Neymar made his first contract, he had other managers and stuff, but the dad was always shadowing those managers and learning from them. And he said, I quickly realized that if I want to help my son and be a part of his life, I'm going to have to evolve just as quickly as he will as a professional manager, as him as an athlete. And they really grew together, and obviously not a straight line, and there's a lot of ups and downs in that, but that's a really fascinating story.
Yeah. No, and which you bring to the screen, and which we see. I mean, like you said, it's well, people have to watch it, but I mean, it's not. I mean, we could talk about it for hours, and people wouldn't necessarily get the right idea, at least from me, because it is very, it's complicated, but it's also much more than. It's certainly not Britney Spears' dad. It's certainly, it's more than the Williams sisters and tennis parents. He's. I mean, it comes out a few times. He's. Whatever you think, he is trying to create this security for his son that's going to outlive his soccer playing days, which and Neymar seems to. I think there's that father-son tension always there, but he seems to appreciate that, at least on some level.
Absolutely. I can go as far as saying that, he is a visionary in sports marketing. Like pretty incredible. I was very fortunate. I have a whole other career that, I've worked a lot in advertising and with brands and work. I've been lucky to work with Steve Jobs at Apple and with Brian Chesky at Airbnb. Yeah. And especially with Brian Chesky very closely. And Neymar's dad, in his own Brazilian way, refined way, they have a lot of similarities, and me and him talk a lot about that. And I think that's why we got along very well, because he knew that I was able to appreciate his vision as a businessman,
Okay. I think that brings us to a good point to give our listeners a little break. So we'll be right back with David Charles Rodrigues, the director of Neymar, The Perfect Chaos, streaming now on Netflix as of January 25th. If you enjoy Factual America, check out the Movie Maker podcast. That's all one word, Movie Maker, where our friends at moviemaker.com interview everyone from filmmakers just breaking in to A-listers like David Fincher and Edgar Wright about their movie-making secrets and behind-the-scenes tricks of the trade. They go deep and let the guests speak uninterrupted to get you the most film insight. Now back to Factual America. Welcome back to Factual America. I'm here with award-winning director David Charles Rodrigues. The film is Neymar, The Perfect Chaos, out now on Netflix. We were just talking about, we were talking about your discussions with his Neymar's father. How did this project come about? Did the family approach Netflix? How did this all get started?
Yeah, I'll start with how kind of I got into it, and then we can start that. I was working with my dear friend Ricardo Viramontes, who's the head of creative at Spring Hill.
Okay.
We were we were doing a series on basketball players and their tattoos, completely unrelated to this.
Okay.
And suddenly, out of the blue, through LeBron and Maverick's relationship with Neymar, they sent us, this opportunity and said, hey, Netflix signed a deal with Neymar, and Neymar really wants to work with you guys because he really likes, Uninterrupted in Spring Hill's kind of way of telling athlete stories, right? Their brand value is more than an athlete, right? And they were very interested in that. And I just happened to be there at the time, and I really, I'm not a typical sports person. I played basketball, and I grew up in football, so you inherently know all things about football.
Yeah.
I'm not a sports fanatic, but I think it really helped craft an angle and show a more broader picture of things that you don't necessarily have to be a sports fan to really like this series, and I think that's what made the difference and got us to starting the production on this.
I was going to ask you later, but you mentioned LeBron James. I mean, maybe you could say a little bit more about his company. I know he's got an exec producer role on this film, and then also Neymar himself obviously has an affinity for basketball, and I think he was wearing LeBron's jersey on a few occasions in the film. It's an interesting relationship. But what's it like working with LeBron James on a film?
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of Spring Hill and what they believe in, and they do things, and they have a really strong team of people. From Jamal Henderson to Matt. And Ricardo and Devin and many other, and Phil and many other executives that I work more closely with. Then you have LeBron and Maverick, who run the show, and what they really do is they open the doors for us, and they make sure that the quality is at the highest level, and I think of my experience working with them is really their belief and their trust and their support throughout the process. Everything we needed and wanted to make this successful, they helped us make it happen, which is the dream role for an executive producer, I guess.
Yeah. And I guess with them on board, as you say, when you ring up David Beckham or Messi or Suarez or whoever, I guess, and tell them you're making a Neymar doc, I guess they say yes. No questions asked, isn't it?
Between them and Neymar, that was very helpful. And I would love to mention also, this was a co-production with Campfire. They've been doing a lot of great work for Netflix and other streamers in the doc space. And my producer, Cecilia, and Ross Gerard and Ross Dinnerstein also, did everything they could humanly possibly do. And obviously, in the post-production side, Make and Angus Wall and Will Z were able to, get our thousands of hours of footage and shape it into something that, I'm quite proud of, to be honest.
Well, I definitely think you should be. And while we're still talking tangentially about basketball, I guess, I think another element there, you were talking about this sort of, coming of age story in essence, is we talked about COVID, we talked about things, but Kobe Bryant's untimely death seems to have had a big, at least that's the way it looks to me while watching it, that had a big impact on Neymar. Is that fair enough to say?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up something that I didn't really know about Neymar, which I love because I'm a basketball fan as a player. He's wearing those jerseys is what he does. It's totally unprompted. It has nothing. Even when the camera was off, he was, doing that. That's his thing. He really loves basketball and the players, and is friends with many of them. And he had worked with Kobe before. They weren't close friends, but I think Kobe and Jordan are actually, I think even more than Pelé, are really his benchmarks and his inspiration, of what modern competitiveness means, and about what it to be at the highest level, and obviously Messi, I guess, right? I would put Messi, Kobe and Jordan as probably the top three main influences for Neymar. and I think, you know, we were all together in Paris filming when the tragedy happened and Kobe passed away, and that was really I don't want to say the start, but like the moment that I saw the greatest shift in him realizing his own mortality, and also realizing that, you know, he is a full adult, and he has to take the reins of his own life and really give his best in every way he can to leave a legacy behind and to be able to accomplish the things that he first set out on doing, you know, and you know, whenever someone that you admire or someone that inspires you passes away and young and at such a tragic way, you kind of feel this spiritual obligation of doing your best to keep them alive, right? To keep their way of doing things alive. And I feel like that was really felt during that time. And yeah, it was really emotional. I mean, we were, you know, there was a lot of stuff that we weren't even able to film because it was a very emotional moment.
Yeah. I mean, talking about these, you do, but at the same time, we do see all these moments with Neymar, and he opens up his life to us. I mean, obviously he had editorial control, but what input did Neymar have to telling his story? I mean, I like the beginning. He says, well, how do you want it to begin? And I think at the end, you're saying, well, is this the way it's going to end? I mean, it's kind of interesting. He's as he said, he's buying into what this is really about. But at the same time, you don't pull any punches. I mean, you show all the stuff. You show the fact that people were calling him a monster. We've got the whole, you know, it's known as, you know, people have criticized him for a lot of things. You said we haven't even really talked too much about it, about the controversy, but there's certainly been a lot of controversy that's followed Neymar over the years. So how was that relationship? Did he and his dad ever try to? Well, there's always a little bit of a pushing back from the subjects, but how was that relationship?
It was really good. Obviously, there were moments that, you know, I had to work on helping them, you know, have a leap of faith and really trusting in my process. I think through our time together, he understood that he really needed to give me everything so I could tell the best story possible. You know, I always made it clear, and this is what I do with every project is, you know, the boss or the final cut for me personally is the best film. You know, it's the best story. It's the best way to convey a message or someone's, you know, journey on screen. And I believe they believed in me. You know, they really believed that that was the boss. That was my ulterior motive. Wasn't, you know, pointing fingers or being, you know, sensationalist, or it was literally telling the best story. And to tell the story, you have to open the wounds, you know, and you have to bear all. And I think, you know, he really did that. And it was funny because I had interviewed him a bunch in several parts of his house. Unfortunately, he's so famous, he can't go out, you know, like it's very hard, like the security detailing, and like for him to go have dinner, it's insane, you know, and to go with a crew is almost impossible. Yeah. So we had to make the most of filming him in his house, you know, which in a way it worked out because that's where he can be his true self. And to a point where I kind of had filmed everywhere. And the only place that's off limits in his house, even to the people that work with him every day, is his bedroom. Right. It's kind of private Idaho. It's his own universe. Yeah. And I kept manager, you know, his sub manager, right? His father's right-hand man. Yeah. Can we film in his room? I think it would be really special. Like, you know, we're this whole intimacy, you know, getting a look into his room, you know, it will be great. And then, you know, I kept getting no. And you know, for good or for bad, I'm kind of, you know, like a whack-a-mole, you know, I just keep popping up and then I think the guy kind of lost his patience and was like, just ask Neymar, you know, he'll say no. And if he says no, that's it. Yeah. And then I just went up and asked him and he was like, oh yeah, sure. Let's do it. And then like 5 minutes later, we were in his bedroom, which had never been filmed before. And we're there, and, you know, his friends were watching but I just thought it would make more sense for him just to do what he always does, which is just hang out with his friends and have a candid conversation. And we talked for a couple hours, and it was really special. And then at the very end, when we were wrapping up, that's when I kind of had the idea just on the spot of asking him how he would open the film, and then he just had a brilliant answer, and that really dictated, part of the structure, just that spontaneous moment. And then obviously later in a interview months later, I asked him how he would finish it just so we could have that to be able to create that structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a really special moment. Like when you see it and you see it on camera, his eyes kind of light up. And that's one thing that I realized and I wish, I don't know, if we ever film together again, I would like to explore more.
Yeah.
He's a really creative person. Like right now in his life, he truly expresses that creativity as a player, as an athlete.
Yeah.
And you see glimpses of it on social media, but he's an incredible illustrator. Like he can draw manga like no one. Wow. And the title of the film, he called me and said, "Hey, I was writing all the titles and I found some that I thought were good, but nothing really landed yet." And he was like, "Would you consider The Perfect Chaos?" And I was like, "Oh my God, that's genius." I really was. If it was, I don't think that would work. But I really encapsulated the story we were trying to tell in his life. And his creativity is something that I feel is untapped territory. And I believe that especially once he retires, it will really start to blossom in his life.
Well, that's very interesting because this is a guy, as you say, who's not even 30. And you're telling the story of his life, but his life's hopefully not even halfway over yet. It's only a third done, and you could be there for parts 2 and 3, hopefully.
Yeah, we'll see.
We'll see. And then, I gather, because I've then looked at some trailers and stuff, this is a truly international film, isn't it? Because it's... You filmed it's all in Portuguese and Spanish and French, and for us English speakers, it's and there's a bit of English obviously with David Beckham and others, but for most of us English speakers, we're hearing it dubbed, but for everyone else, those others, it's releasing in the original languages, isn't it, for Brazilian audiences and stuff like that?
Yeah, what people don't realize in America, and I hope they do while watching this, is that football is the most global sport ever. The most global form of entertainment, and Neymar is that person. I think even Netflix, it's already, getting insane traction, on Twitter and on Netflix. Obviously, I don't have the numbers yet, but just by looking through Twitter, and through the media reports, you can see that it's literally everywhere. Everywhere in the world, they're all watching this story, and it is a truly global story. And that's what I really love about Netflix is, whether it's through Squid Game or other properties that they are able to bring different cultures and different languages and very unique stories to everyone, especially to America. I remember in Brazil, I would literally go 3 times a week at least to this little art house theater in my hometown. And I would watch films from every single country, because they would get all kinds of films. And in America, that's just not the case. It's very closed off, up until Netflix. I really think that Netflix paved the way, and now a bunch of other people are following suit to doing that.
Or when I was growing up in the States, you either had to live in a college town or in a certain big cities, and you knew the art house, theater that would show these things. But otherwise, yes, you would never have a clue that all this was out there. So I think that's a very good point. Hat tip to Netflix certainly for that. I think we're coming to maybe one last thing. Obvious question, but you grew up in Brazil. What does Neymar mean to Brazil?
Neymar is a symbol of the divisiveness that Brazil is going through. That's very similar to America. Tom Jobim, the famous, musician, has a great quote that's being successful in Brazil is a personal offense. And I feel like, unfortunately, Neymar gets a lot of that from people. But at the same time, he also inspires millions of people there that it's possible. They like his father likes to call him the possible hero. And I think that he is true to many people.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think it's on Netflix as well. There's a Pele documentary. And
there is, yeah.
Yeah, and I think he went through some similar, different time period, but being it's also the sort of the things you hear about Michael Jordan sometimes, he wasn't outspoken enough, he didn't take sides or whatever. And it's I guess it's a difficult place to be if you're the hero of a country. David, more in terms of your own yourself and your career. I think you've mentioned already. You've got this extensive commercial success, literally commercial success. How did you move into documentaries? That's relatively recent, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, I want to say since 2014. So
yeah.
It's
been a while.
Years.
Yeah.
Documentary work is not that long,
yeah.
but it's really about storytelling and filmmaking. My first creative job ever was as a comic writer.
Wow.
And then because I grew up, lower middle class and quite poor, I had to make a living. And then I learned that you could make a living and be creative in advertising. And I just kind of stumbled into that career and it just, really helped me my whole life. But my goal since the very beginning was to make films. I've been going to film festivals and binging, movies, since I was literally, I tell this story when I was 12 years old. It was one of the worst economic crises in Brazil. And it was my summer vacation and, we couldn't afford to go anywhere or do anything. But my mother, God bless her soul, gave me a video membership card to a video club that was on the same block house, and I didn't have to cross the streets. I could walk there, and I would watch, and it had a limit of 5 films a day, and I watched 5 films a day for 3 months straight, and that was my first film school, and so for me, it's really. It's very corny and cliche to say this, but I'm really living my dream. And I think I found the documentary form. I think what's happened today, and you see it at Sundance, for example, I think the indie cinema of the 90s has become what documentary filmmaking is now. The most exciting, most interesting, most daring films told in the independent space are documentaries. And I feel like kind of inadvertently, that's how I fell into that. First by, I made this film Mythical Creatures, which was part of the Sundance New Frontier program. And then Gay Chorus Deep South, that's really when I fully found my voice as a filmmaker. And I tried to really bring that experience into Neymar and really just bring the heart and soul of telling a human story, which is kind of what I feel most comfortable doing and what I love doing the best.
Hey, and let's face it, some of the legends of this business also did advertising. You're not you won't be the first one to have gone that route. So well done. And what's next for you?
Yeah, I have 2 projects right now that I'm attached to. One where we shot some stuff and we're about to go into full production. It's about social media addiction. And I'm doing it with Jigsaw. I can't say much more about it, but it's very exciting and important for the times we're living in right now. And then another one that I'm super excited about, and we're in the process of pitching it, is we're doing a film about the dynasty of the Golden State Warriors. And I'm doing that. Slam Magazine and Mandalay, who did The Last Dance.
Wow.
Hopefully we start shooting, but I'm very excited about that. As a basketball fan.
And is there some Last Dance type footage that's out there? Is that what can you say?
Yeah.
Yes. Excellent. Wow.
Yeah.
That could be well, I think you're going to be busy. I think you're also going to be successful. So well done and congratulations. And just want to say thank you. Thanks so much for coming on to Factual America. It's been a pleasure having you on. And just remind people, our listeners and watchers, that we've been talking with award-winning director David Charles Rodrigues. The film is, docuseries, actually, is Neymar, The Perfect Chaos, out now on Netflix. Check it out. I'd like to give a shout-out to Sam and Joe Graves at Intersound Audio in Eskrick, England, in deepest, darkest Yorkshire. A big thanks to Nevin Apaunovich, podcast manager at Alamo Pictures, who ensures we continue getting great guests onto the show. And finally, a big thanks to our listeners. As always, we love to hear from you, so please keep sending us feedback and episode ideas. You can reach out to us on YouTube, social media, or directly by going to our website, www.factualamerica.com, and clicking on the Get in Touch link. And as always, please remember to like us and share us with your friends and family, wherever you happen to listen or watch podcasts. This is Factual America, signing off.
You've been listening to Factual America. This podcast is produced by Alamo Pictures, specializing in documentaries, television, and shorts about the USA for international audiences. Head on down to the show notes for more information about today's episode, our guests, and the team behind the podcast. Subscribe to our mailing list or follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Alamo Pictures. Be the first to hear about new productions, festivals showing our films, and to connect with our team. Our homepage is alamopictures.co.uk.